Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. This is Cole with Fishing Elephant Media, and tonight we're going to be kicking off a special series that I'm just going to be starting by myself here. Since we are in the great state of South Dakota, and well, we do have a sports channel called Rushmore Sports Addicts, I figured it's only time that we go ahead and start talking about the Mt.Rushmores of sports. So this is a series where I'm just going to kind of be solo at first. I mean, who knows, however things expand, they expand. But I'm going to be solo talking about my personal favorites of, Mount Rushmore in sports. I feel like I'm a pretty well-versed sports fan, across all the scopes. And I would say football, wrestling, basketball, and baseball would probably be my top four as far as knowledge. Yes, I'm including wrestling as a sport. Obviously, the Spoiler Club t-shirt is on. So spoilers, if you have never seen anything for professional wrestling, you want to get into it, I'm going to kind of kill some things tonight for you. But if you don't know about it, then I'm sorry about it. Anyways, tonight we're going to be talking about just that, though, because as I mentioned with wrestling, we are going to talk about the Mount Rushmore of wrestling to kick it off, just because... well, this is probably something that's been a huge, passion of mine since I was a kid, and as a wrestling fan, as every wrestling fan is, I feel like you're really off and on as being a fan. There's times where I'm absolutely into it. I mean, probably every year for WrestleMania, I'd say, like, I'm just coming off my WrestleMania high, my WrestleMania kick, where you start watching the Royal Rumble, you watch the follow-up pay-per-views, and then you watch WrestleMania. And then afterwards, it's like this hangover. But... I don't know. Just my passion for wrestling, kind of stands all out, and it's growing every single day because now we have AEW, we have independent, wrestling promotions hopping up all over. Promotions like Impact Wrestling and Ring of Honor, who are kind of mainstays in that lower independent scene through the mid 2000s. I'm happy to see that they're still around and they're actually thriving. It's nice to see that wrestling is not only growing after the pandemic, but I think it's the strongest it's ever been. Maybe I'm a little biased there because I don't remember. Obviously, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, when people, thought it was real. It wasn't, kayfabed or pre-planned, or some of you would call it, fake. But, I mean, at the end of the day, still, I think this is a time as a wrestling fan you have variety, and you have a lot to look forward to. And so I'm going to do a lot more episodes about that probably by myself. But here, we're just going to break it down. We're going to talk about the Mount Rushmore of wrestling, or at least, in my opinion, mine. So, let's kick it off here. Number one, I'm going to have Bruno Sammartino. Now, like I said, I wasn't around to watch wrestling in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But if I was, I'm sure Bruno would definitely be first on this list regardless. I mean, the man had a 12-year title run. I mean, split across 2 runs, but still. 7 years, 2,803 days. Yes, I wrote it down because I'm not really good with remembering numbers off the top of my head. But, Bruno was a legend. Seriously, like, he packed Madison Square Garden night after night after night. I mean, if you grew up in New York City in the 70s, you knew Bruno Sammartino. I mean, he was a legend. He's still a superstar for Italian Americans, I'm sure, everywhere. I don't know. I can't speak for the Italians, I guess. So as far as the Irish, I'm not really a big fan of Sammartino, probably in retrospect. But, you got to respect the legend, that the man brought to the table. With the 2 longest title reigns ever, just being that champion that the WWF, owned by Vince McMahon Sr. at the time, carried through and became probably the most dominant of what was territorial promotions at the time. Like, this man probably sold out Madison Square Garden more times than anybody else because that was their main venue. Wrestling was in a completely different place back then. I mean, if we want to talk about it and really break it down, we're talking territories. We're talking 15, 20, 30 different wrestling promotions across the U.S., all sticking to, like, these little geographical locations. And it's kind of exciting to think about because back then, obviously, that's the way a lot of things were. You had local television, you only had local TV, you heard about the news around you, and then maybe some of the national news filtered in, but you were very much kind of concerned with your own region. Well, that's exactly the way wrestling was, but still, Bruno Sammartino, his name stood across the nation. And anytime he went to any arena outside of New York, outside of the WWF's territory, he went gangbusters. It was crazy. The man... I can't explain it. Seriously, just Google Bruno Sammartino, look into it for 30 minutes. Look into it for 15 minutes. You will figure out how big he was in his day. And that's why he's getting number 1 on my list. Number 2, I think it's a very obvious one. It's going to be Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold was the best part about the Attitude Era. It was kind of... when I was starting to become a wrestling fan myself, I kind of remember watching, back in the day, watching Stone Cold bring the beer truck out, spraying down Vince McMahon, The Rock, and the rest of the corporation. I only wish I was a couple of years more older so I could have actually fully gotten to experience the Monday Night Wars. And I have gone back and watched it, and it's awesome. The technical wrestling aspect is not great about the Attitude Era. We're just going to knock that one out right there. It was definitely more about personality. It was more about being like the Jerry Springer Show and just doing outrageous shit. And during that time, Stone Cold, who I will say is a very respectable technical wrestler, stood head and shoulders above everybody. Seriously, at the time when the WWE was, or WWF at that time, was just a fledgling promotion. They were losing all of their stars to WCW. Stone Cold came out of nowhere. He was a heel with the Stone Cold character at first. When he won the 1996 King of the Ring, beating Jake the Snake Roberts in the final, he delivered his famous Austin 316 promo. You talk about your Johns, you talk about your Psalms, you talk about your 316s. Well, Austin 316 says, I just whooped your ass. And the WWE would like you to fucking think that's rocket shipped from there. But, that's by far not the case. Seriously, I think it took probably about 3 months when I was going through my rewatch before you actually started probably hearing in the announcer's voices the actual, real push behind him. The actual, rocket ship that we are to believe was just out of the system. But still, Stone Cold Steve Austin, he ran amok through the 90s. I think he was so popular, that's half the reason Goldberg got over originally. Goldberg, all he is just Stone Cold Steve Austin, the streak, and the spear. Not a big Goldberg fan personally myself, but I do respect his place among, popular wrestling stars. Still, though, like I said, Stone Cold Steve Austin was the most popular superstar during the most popular era. And for that, he has to be on the list. Not only that, but like I said, I'm personally a huge Stone Cold fan. He's a top 3 wrestler for me. I don't know if I have a definite ranking system, or I might. Who knows? We'll wait and see. But like I said, Stone Cold definitely belongs in the Mount Rushmore of Wrestling. So, number 3, I'm going to take another person from the Attitude Era. And that's going to be The Undertaker. Now, I debated on this one because what we'll cover in the honorable mentions is I do have The Rock in there. And The Rock almost belongs on this part of the list. But The Undertaker was not only there during the good times, but he was there during the bad. Multiple bad times. He debuted in 1991 at Survivor Series. And so, the same pay-per-view as the Gobbledygooker, the infamous Hector Guerrero coming out of an egg in a rooster costume. But anyways, The Undertaker's been a legend for years, but he was in the WWF when it was fledgling and during the early 90s, mid-90s, during that kind of really weird cartoon era, because I felt like wrestling was kind of cartoony in the 80s, but yeah, it got weird. It got really weird in the early 90s. They pretty much had this job era. And, well, to do a job in wrestling is to, take the fall, to lose. But no, they started having wrestlers do actual jobs. They had hockey players, garbage men, clowns. And Doink the Clown was actually probably one of the better parts of wrestling during that era. But The Undertaker kind of came out as one of those characters that stuck. It was the right mix of creepy, but also a wrestling character. And I don't know, The Undertaker over time, I don't know if you debut him and if his career goes any different, if he is as big as he is, because it's a crazy ride. We're starting to really reflect back now because, kind of shooting this, if I'm looking really back someday at 2021, we're kind of going after The Undertaker and what, it was his last ride series. We got that documentary right after The Last Dance last year. And so everybody's been kind of talking about The Undertaker. He retired last year at Survivor Series. And this is really when you're starting to kind of hit that career reflection point. And looking back, we're talking the streak. He was a star right out of the gate, winning the WWF title from Hulk Hogan, at that Tuesday in Texas in December of 1991. So he was a star right away. And I think for 30 years, he held the torch. He was there after the Attitude Era too, after Austin split, after The Rock split, after Brock Lesnar split. Which, obviously, Brock Lesnar is not an Attitude Era star, but, Hulk Hogan came back and split again, but The Undertaker was the one consistent person that's just stayed through it all. He held that WWF/WWE flag his entire career. He could have left elsewhere. Sure, he was Mean Mark Callis in WCW, but I'm talking about just The Undertaker here. I think he belongs on the list. This is going to be really debatable because now we're getting down to kind of the tight squeeze spots, but I'm putting The Undertaker on because of his longevity and his importance in wrestling. I think any mainstream fan nowadays, and for years to come, will talk about The Undertaker, hands down. So that makes 3. Obviously, I got Bruno, Stone Cold, and Taker so far. I'm going to do some honorable mentions here before I kind of get to the 4 slot. We'll do, obviously, The Rock. The Rock almost kind of gets on this list. I just feel like his career was too short. What are we looking like? 1995 when he first debuted as Rocky Maivia all the way until 2003, 2004. Debatably when he was more part-time during the last couple of years, and then, his little WrestleMania matches here and there. The Rock is fantastic, but he's far exceeded anything he did in wrestling in movies and in Hollywood. So that's kind of where I leave him off this list, because, I mean, if we're talking Mount Rushmore of juiced up action stars, The Rock's definitely on that one. So, but I'm going to leave him off this list as an honorable mention. Second, I'm going to go with Hulk Hogan. Now, a lot of people are probably thinking that's who I'm going to put in my fourth spot, but honestly, was never that big of a Hulk Hogan fan. I get the appeal. I really do. Back in the 80s, Hulk was just everything, and you had never seen that type of superstar before on a national stage. You know what I mean? He got a lot of people into wrestling, and I'll give him his credit for it, but the man Terry Bollea, I'm not a fan of at all. I didn't like the Hogan's reality show. I think he shit down his entire career by going to TNA. And then, well, let's just talk about Bubba the Love Sponge and that whole sex tape scandal with the little racist tirade at the end. That's a nice little bow on top there. Don't get me wrong. Wrestling is a dirty sport. It's not exactly all roses and bushes outside of, the squared circle, but yeah, I'm not a fan of Hulk Hogan, but I do have to give him an honorable mention spot on here because, well, he was arguably the biggest wrestling star of all time. I would have Stone Cold Steve Austin ahead of him there, but in his day, in the 80s, shit. The entire WWF was Hulk Hogan. I mean, there's no way around it. Obviously, you had Randy Savage, you had Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Roddy Piper. There was all these different stars in there, but it was Hogan's ballgame, it was Hogan's show. Everybody else was just playing in Hogan's world. So, and finally, the last shout out I do want to actually give here is actually going to be to an independent wrestler who I'm going to put on my Mount Rushmore. That's going to be Kenny Omega. I think we're going to look back in 10 to 15 years from now, and we're going to realize me kicking the stand was not very good for this video. Sorry, after a little technical break, we are back. But last honorable mention, honestly, I was going to give out was to Kenny Omega. Now, I think we're going to look back here in 10 to 15 years, and this is why I'm putting him in the honorable mention spot. Obviously not anywhere on, the list of wrestling, but I'm going to throw him like the number 7 grade because when you look back, I think Kenny was the biggest star in Japan rising through that, and there's a lot of people to credit for AEW. There's a lot of people to credit for the independent wrestling scene coming back, but I think Kenny Omega and the matches he had with Okada, the matches he had with Chris Jericho, and the role he's played so far in AEW and the rise that it's having right now, I think Kenny Omega saved the secondary part of wrestling that is not WWE. And I think that growing up in a time when it was just WWE, I love having these options. Now, I love watching Impact back in the day, right before Hulk Hogan came in and just turned it to shit. Back when you had guys like AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, the Motor City Machine Guns, Alex Shelley and Chris Sabian. Like, I loved those guys. They had so many great tag teams. LAX, the X Division in Impact Wrestling was awesome. I remember just, waiting to watch it. And I was probably more excited some years during that for Spike TV than I was for USA just because I loved Impact over Raw. But Raw was obviously the better produced show. It had the bigger stars. So at the end of the day, it was the better product to watch. But I just love independent wrestling coming back. I love the quality that it's coming back with. And I think Kenny Omega is probably the biggest person to thank for that. I don't think he's the only person. But like I said, I think we're going to look back in 10 to 15 years and what he's doing specifically at this time with AEW, with Impact, kind of starting to weave these brands in and out. And we're starting to see shades of the territorial wrestling days. So personally, like I said, big fan of it. Can't wait to see what's going to happen. Last, though, I'm going to give my fourth spot on Mount Rushmore. The fourth horseman, Ric Flair. Woo! Are you kidding me? If I didn't name him in the honorable mentions list, you have to put the Nature Boy on this list. 16-time world champion. Led WCW and the other Jim Crockett promotions, the other little, NWA territories back in the 80s. I mean, Ric Flair was just that half little step below Hulk Hogan as far as popularity-wise, but better technical wrestler, hell of a showman, and he stood the test of time a lot better. Now, Rick is not exactly PG off screen, but, he's not exactly a racist piece of shit either. And I think, when we look really back at it, the pop culture impact that Ric Flair has had across, just generations, because there are people in the South who worship Ric Flair to this day. I think if you look at a certain area of the country, as hands down to this day, Ric Flair is the greatest wrestler still. I don't think a lot of people talk about Hulk like that unless they're kind of a little bit ignorant to what's been going on. You get the other chatters out there, the Undertaker, Stone Cold. You get some really old people, Bruno Sammartino. Curious ones like Macho Man Randy Savage, Jesse the Body Ventura. I've heard Mr. Perfect. That one I did appreciate, though. Kurt Hennig was very, very, very underappreciated in his career. Should have been a WWF champion. But I have to give it to Ric Flair for the fourth spot because, woo! I love Ric Flair. Just the style, the charisma, the arrogance, but I mean, it's bordering cocky and arrogant. Like, Ric Flair was the ultimate showman. He was good in the ring. He made the perfect foil for any face. And I think that is what is a very underappreciated art by the mainstream wrestling fan is the bad guys, the heels. The heels are fantastic. One of my favorite wrestlers of this generation is Randy Orton because he's constantly been able to get different faces over. He's been able to get these different guys over just because he's a prick. You want to boo him, and I love that aspect of it because you have to have a villain in every single story. You have to. It's good versus evil, baby. It's the greatest arc of all time. So that's why I'm giving my number 4 spot to Ric Flair. And that's where we're kicking off the Mount Rushmore wrestling list here. Got Bruno Sammartino, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, and Ric Flair. I don't know if the heads are going to match up when I did that. Obviously, it's dropping back on a green screen, but it's going to be fun to watch back. Anyways, though, I really appreciate you guys tuning in here. This is going to be posted on the Fishing Elephant Media and my personal channel as well. Just kind of some solo projects I'll be doing. Once again, the old YouTube like, share, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. But once again, man, for Fishing Elephant Media, for Beers and Bullshit, Rushmore Sports Addicts, I'm Cole Blenner. Peace out.